Hey, welcome back, everyone. We are here on the First Canada stream. I'm Karthik Kanagas of Apathy, and I'm going to be talking about effective first strategies. So this is normally a 2-hour presentation, but for today, the presentation was sent out in advance to our FTC teams, and now we're going to do some Q&A on the whole topic. So if you have any questions, drop them in the Twitch chat. We're here to talk about how to strategically plan out an FTC robot, how to break down a game, how to do that sort of game analysis. So if you got questions, drop them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. But in the meantime, maybe we'll take a look at some of my slides as we wait for questions to come in. And so there's a couple of things I want to focus on. And number one is basically this concept of simplicity. So I really believe that there's like two golden rules when it comes to building a first robot. And number one is like you always have to build within your team's limits. So with any first game, there's always multiple tasks that can be done. But you have to understand this is different than in school. So in school, when you get an assignment and the assignment has like 7 different things to do, you have to do all 7 of them. You can't just pick and choose what you want to do, but that's not how it works in first. In first, you don't have to do everything that's in the game. That might sound weird. It's like, well, how am I going to do well if I don't do everything? You have to understand they give you more things than most teams could possibly do. So you need to pick and choose and do the things that are the things that you're best at and that you can do to the best of your capabilities. So you kind of have to build within your limits. So how do we define our limits? Well, number one, you need to do this process honestly, realistically, because if it's kind of like going to the mall and saying, oh, like thinking that you have $10,000 to spend on some new clothes, but you only actually have like $50. So like you'll pick out a bunch of stuff and you can't actually buy it. And it's the same thing with building a robot, except it's not as like defined, so it gets a little bit more complicated. But your limits are defined by the amount of people power you have on your team, budget, experience. This year, we're in a very strange year because of COVID, and so teams may not be able to meet as often. Teams may not be able to get access to as many parts, and so that's a limit that you need to be thinking about as you're building your robot. You may want to build a lot simpler than you normally would because your team's only going to be able to meet once a week. You might be registering a team right now, but you understand that our team's probably not going to be allowed to meet until January. So that's totally like it'd be one thing to start CADing and coming up with a super complex robot, but if you're only going to start meeting in January, you're not necessarily going to be able to build that whole thing. So you want to avoid building unnecessarily complex robots. So where does this go into? The next golden rule. And this is like the most golden of the rules that I have. And if you're going to walk away with anything from today, this is the one. So the jack of all trades is the master of none. If you have like, remember I was talking about the analogy of going to the mall, have $10,000. Let's say we're going to the robot store and we're purchasing robot functions. And each team has like 30 units of functions that they can purchase, but functions have a maximum value of 10. It's always better to have 3 things at 10 out of 10 than 5 at 6 out of 10. The jack of all trades is the master of none. In first, in FTC, in FRC, you'd much rather have a robot that's really, really good at a couple things than mediocre at a lot of things. And like this is the key to success in first that most teams miss, because most teams think like it's like a school assignment. I have to do everything. I have to try and do everything. But you don't. You can just focus on a couple of things. And so how do I choose what to figure out? And like that's what this whole presentation on effective first strategies is about. I don't have time to walk through all of it, but we can kind of touch through some of the issues. But when you're trying to figure out what to do, you want to hit the items that have the most value for the least effort and things that'll consistently get you value. So Sarah, if we could jump to slide 11. There we go. And back one more, actually to slide 10 to start it off, because we just gave away the answers by going backwards. We pulled some Doctor Strange stuff. Nope, one forward. Nope, forward. Slide 10. There we go. Oh, back. Slide 10. There we go. So priority lists. What should be number 1? What should be number 2? What should be number 3? So when you're trying to prioritize what your robot's going to look like, what's the number 1 thing that your robot needs to have? What's the number 1 thing? And so often when I ask this question, people are like, Scoring is the number one thing we have to do. We have to be able to score, but that's actually not the number one thing you need to be able to do. I actually have scoring usually number 3. So now if we jump to slide 11 to see the answers, move. Your robot has to be able to move. That's number one. And like you're gonna be like, well, yeah, but scoring's the point, and everyone's gonna move. True. But when you come up with the priority list, you have to rank things in terms of importance and understanding that if all else fails, if you can still move, you will probably still be able to earn points in autonomous because there's usually points for just moving in autonomous, which is massive, and you can still play defense. So movement is key. Now, there's obviously someone's going to be like, oh, well, there was this one game years ago where teams could be stationary. Sure. It happens from time to time, but for the most part, moving is super, super critical. So that's why your drivetrain needs to be your priority. Your drivetrain has to be 10 out of 10. So you're going to focus a huge amount of resources into it. And this whole presentation, I really recommend that you check it out on YouTube. Just search Karthik and Effective First Strategies, walks through this whole process on detailing everything. But movement's number one, always. Now, number 2, before score, well, you can't score a game piece unless you have some way of acquiring the game piece and releasing the game piece. So that's got to be the next thing you're working on, your intake system. Now, some games you're able to receive game pieces from the human player, so maybe that's going to be your primary means of intake. But otherwise, you need a way to be able to suck things up off the ground. And with whatever the game piece may be, it could be bricks, it could be balls, it could be frisbees. You want this game piece to be super, super efficient. 10 out of 10. The mantra I live by with all intakes is touch it and you own it. So you want to be able to have your robot drive around. As soon as it touches something, sucks it in somehow. I've never been a fan of pinchy claws because that's a lot. That's not touch it and you own it. You're trying to drive, you touch it and you have to adjust clamp. Roller intakes are like the key to anything you're doing in FTC. Andy Mark is a big supporter of FTC. You can buy their stuff through Studica. Has a lot of compliant wheels where if you spin them at a high velocity, they can suck up pretty much any type of game piece. But you really want to work on the system and nail it. And so that's why acquire release is number 2. And remember what I was saying, you want to hit things at 10 out of 10. What does a 10 out of 10 acquisition system look like? Touch it and you own it. Also, be able to pick things up from a variety of angles so you don't have to be perfectly lined up every time. You just want to be able to like move around the field and just suck up the game pieces. I have no idea what the game looks like this year, so but from year to year, acquisition is always at the top. So we've actually got some questions in here right now, so I'm going to take a look to see what we have. Our first question is, do you think the golden rules will be different with remote events, or will they stay the same? The golden rules, if we can just jump ahead to slide 12 so everyone can see the golden rules again. The golden rules are constant. That's why they're so golden. With remote events, what changes is your limits and your resources, because it's not necessarily the remote events piece that's changing it, but how often your team can meet. Now, the other piece with remote events is that you're playing individually now, so you don't have an alliance partner. So things shift a little bit in that in the past, you can be like, well, I don't need to do everything because my alliance partner can do some of the things, but it still applies because trying to do everything in the time period, you may not be able to have time to accomplish everything. So since you know your robot's going to be running on a field by itself, you know exactly how much time you have. And if you design a robot that can do, like say your robot has 4 functions, and you're like, oh yeah, with 4 functions we can do everything except, oh, we're going to run out of time. Like we don't actually have time. Then why are you building the 4 functions? You see what I'm saying? Like you might want to simplify and just do 3 things and fill your time that way. So there's a little bit of planning differences when it comes to the remote events, but at the end of the day, the golden rules still sort of apply where you've got to figure out what your limits are in terms of what you can build, but also within the time frames and the time constraints of the match, and then maximize what you're going to do within that to get your full utility. Is there a difference in moving in auto versus teleop, or are they both number 1 priority? So I would consider the difference between moving in autonomous and teleop to be like a strategic difference. But when it comes to your strategic design, you want your robot to have the ability to move. And then it's definitely more important to move in teleop than it is to move in autonomous because teleop is longer. And also the effort reward ratio. Moving in teleop is a lot easier than moving in auto, but you want your robot to have that ability to move, you know, your robot to be mobile such that it can be moved in the two different periods. And for those of you who are coming from an FRC background where autonomous is often an afterthought because it's only 15 seconds, well, autonomous has traditionally been much longer in FDC, and I assume it's going to be longer this year, probably 30, 45 seconds. So that's a bigger chunk of your match. So autonomous becomes really, really crucial. We saw in the Kahoot this morning from Game Manual 1, autonomous is also the #1 tiebreaker in the standings, which is probably going to be very important. Question, are defensive robots a good strategic choice this season? So again, not having seen the game, but understanding the rules about remote events, I would think not, because you're not playing an opponent with the remote events. You're running your robot by itself in a 1 versus 0 match. So who are you actually going to be playing defense on? Now, there's different forms of defense. When we think of defense, we often think about like robots smashing into each other, robots blocking other robots, but like maybe there's like a deconstruction challenge, which could be considered defensive. And sure, that kind of defense applies. But when it comes to defending another robot, that is not a valuable thing this year because there are no other robots to defend. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. So we're going to kind of check out, see what other questions we may have. You know, back to the kind of what you want your robot to do. We talked about game piece acquisition, but what about game piece release? So one thing that I'm a big fan of is robots, where some robots will acquire a game piece, then they'll move the game piece in the robot somewhere else, and then they'll score from somewhere else. And that's cool because like you think about acquisition and release, and you think about scoring. But if your game piece is to transition through your robot, don't forget about the transition subsystem, where getting the game piece from your intake to your scoring device, that takes work. Now, sometimes you have an intake that will lift and then your intake will release, and like that's cool. But like a lot of the times, if you're building a robot, for example, to shoot a ball, you have an intake and then the ball has to go through a path to get to the shooter. And it's very easy to say, okay, these two students are going to work on the intake, these two students are going to work on the shooter, and then we'll put it all together. But then you put it all together and you realize you don't have a way to get the balls through. And you might be like, oh yeah, we'll figure it out. The best robots have that full transition from intake through the robot to scoring mechanism fully planned out. And all three of them are needed to score. And if one of them doesn't function, you're toast. And I've seen so many robots over the years that have had great intakes, super geared fast, touch it and you it, and these fabulous shooters, super geared fast, just balls fly out of there when they hand load the balls in them. But getting the balls through the system is the hard part. So when you're thinking about all your subsystems of your robot, you have to consider every distinct subsystem. So if a game piece is interacting through it, it's a subsystem. Now, again, to simplify these sorts of things, that's why people love robots with arms, because instead of the ball moving through the system, the ball's being elevated with an arm, which is a little bit easier. There's less variables in what can go on, but that's kind of where we're at. Oh, we got another question coming in. If you have more than one game piece, how do you pick which one to attempt first? That's a great question from Kate in the chat. It comes down to value. So the first thing you're going to do when you get this game manual, and let's back up. Let's see if we can go to like slide number 3. Oh, and let's go to slide 5. I don't actually know my slide numbers off by heart, I'm guessing. And right, yep, and now slide 6. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much to Sarah, our producer in chat, who's just navigating her way through my confusing slides. So that's awesome. So the first thing you want to do when you get the full game is to read the rules. And once you read the rules, you need to examine every possible way to score points. And once you've examined all the different ways to score points, you'll see that game piece A ends up getting me this amount of points, and game piece B ends up getting me this amount of points. So you want to look at you want to rank things based on which ones are worth the most amount of points. And so then you might be like, oh, well, obviously I'm going to do the things worth the most amount of points. And I'm going to be like, hold up. It's not necessarily about that, because you then have to look at the difficulty of picking something up. So like, let's say there was a 15-pound bowling ball as a game piece this year and a half-pound wiffle ball. And say the bowling ball was worth 4 points and the wiffle ball was worth 2 points. And you had to put them in a goal that's 3 feet in the air. Well, if you just do the point analysis, bowling balls are worth more than wiffle balls, so I'm going to do that. But what about the effort and award ratio? Like lifting a 15-pound bowling ball 3 feet in the air versus lifting like a half-pound wiffle ball 3 feet in the air. I can do the wiffle ball. It's way easier, and I can do it faster. So the wiffle ball, first of all, because it's easier, it means that I have to dedicate less robot resources to it. And two, since I can do it faster, I can do more of it. So its value actually increases over the bowling ball. And these are the types of factors you're looking at, because it's not just about the point value, the raw point value. You have to look at how many you'll be able to do in a match. And you want to pick the task that you can get the most reward out of, but also manages your resources, because you might look at that bowling ball and be like, I'm never going to be able to figure out how to lift that bowling ball with our motors, or the amount of motors that we can buy, or the amount of motors that we have. I can't figure out how to do this. And that's okay to say, well, that's a little bit outside of our realm of resources. Another question in the chat: is there an effective method to do game analysis as a team? So this is a really good question, because, and it's all about brainstorming. But how do you brainstorm effectively? And how do we brainstorm effectively remotely? Because most teams, if not all teams, are going to be meeting remotely for the beginning part of the season. So I think the first thing that is key is for everyone to read the rules individually, just to go through them. And as you're reading the rules, make some notes, whether on your phone or in the margin if you printed it out, on things you don't really understand. Then I've always liked the team to come together. So maybe do this on a Zoom call. Everyone comes together, and like the team captain or the teacher or the lead mentor walks everyone through the manual. And you're just like, let's all read through it together. Like everyone's read it on their own once, but read through. And now anyone who has questions, like, I don't understand this, ask a question. Don't understand that, ask a question. And what's really important here is to understand there are no bad questions at this point, and no one knows all the answers, because guess what? This is new to everyone. No one's an expert on Ultimate Goal yet. No one. So there are no dumb questions, and it's really important that people ask these questions so others can, because many others might have the same question, and you learn about the game as you talk your way through these rules. So then after you've talked through the rules, it's now time to start ranking things in terms of like, okay, let's just make a list of every single possible way to score points. And you make that list, and that's where the analysis starts flowing from. But it's a creative process, and it's really important to understand, like, everyone can contribute in this, because this is brainstorming. You don't need to be an expert robot designer. You don't need to be a CAD specialist. You don't need to have had years tinkering with old motherboards. None of that stuff matters when it comes to strategic design. It's about problem solving and creative thinking. And like, you know, you don't need to be a technical mind. Like I am like not a robot builder, but I've been doing robot strategy like more than half my life now, which is crazy to think about. And it, I'm just like a math guy and a numbers guy and a sports guy, well, sports watching guy. But strategy is my thing, and anyone can do this stuff. So make sure you have your whole team involved. Like if you've got like people on your team who are just doing awards or just doing the engineering notebook, they can contribute into this piece too. And like, it's the more ideas you have, the better. Another thing that I find really useful, especially now that we're like fully immersed in the digital YouTube era, is to look at the game tasks that you're going to get and then find past FTC, FRC, VRC best games which have had similar game objects and similar tasks, and look to see how those robots have done these things before. There's no need to reinvent the wheel with everything you're doing. So look at some of the best robots in the past to see how they've solved problems. And also, when you're doing that, try and look at robots that kind of match your resource level. Like it would be easy to say, well, I'm just going to look at team gluten-free, team 11155. They're like one of the best teams in FTC history. I'm just going to look at them to see what they've done and like understand that not everyone has the same levels of resources, but finding simple concepts out there that are already on the web is a great idea. One thing that's happening all across the world today is there's a bunch of groups who are going to build an FTC robot in 5 days. And so they're going to get the game, analyze it, and these are usually FTC alums who are now in university and they want to do something fun. They're going to build robots for this game, and that's a great way to get ideas on what you want to do and to see neat mechanisms and neat intakes and all sorts of fun stuff. Another question we have is, how does FRC or FLL strategy translate to FTC? Well, I mean, this presentation that I'm talking about right now, Effective First Strategies, is an FRC-based strategy, but it totally applies to FTC. And also, like, this is a project management strategy in general and like a business strategy. Like, if you want to run a startup, I follow my Effective First Strategies. Where like, except instead of analyzing a game rule, you're analyzing the market, but you're still analyzing your own resources, figuring out what you can do. Like with any small startup, it's about, you can't try, a small startup may not be, a small startup might come into this and say, like, we really want to help with COVID, but a small startup's not going to have the resources to develop a vaccine and distribute it to 7 billion people. Like, that would be outside their scope, so you got to find something smaller and dive into that. But the exact same sort of strategic decisions you make in FRC apply in FTC. And in fact, they're harder in FTC because in FRC, if you come up with a concept, remember, there's like no limits to what you can do in FRC. Like, you can make your robots massive. There's way more COTS parts out there. There's way more sensors you can use. You can go fully wild. Well, FTC, you're more constrained, so that makes it more difficult. So you have to be more judicious about knowing your limits to succeed in FTC. From FLL, it's the same thing, because when you're designing an FLL robot, and actually FLL really applies this year because FLL teams, they understand the world of 1v0. Like, they have their 4x8 and no other robots on the table. So they know how to brainstorm to how to pick which tasks to do when you're the only robot on the field. And FTC teams should really pay attention to that and learn from their FLL alums on how they figured out their robots, because this year's challenge, I'm assuming, is going to have a bit of an FLL-ish kind of field, in that for remote events, it's one robot on its own half of the field by itself. So that's really important to think about. Sorry, my allergies are acting up. It's that time of year, hay fever, ragweed. It's an ordeal. So this is a fun talk about effective first strategies. Let's take a look at the next slide. Chokehold strategies are a fun one. Unfortunately, they aren't going to apply this year because there's no opponents in FTC, so we can skip the chokehold strategy. Cost-benefit analysis, and I've touched on this already, but for each task that you come up with, like for all the offensive tasks in the game, you need to compare the difficulty of accomplishing it to the reward for doing so. And remembering, the best tasks to perform are those which are relatively easy, yet provide big points. So you kind of want to, again, focus on things that earn you the most points, but it's not just the raw point value. You've got to think about the amount of time it takes to compete and how many often things can be done. Also, it's not just about how often it can be done, but the number of game pieces. Like, in some games, game pieces are recycled back on the field, so it's like an infinite supply of game pieces. But in other games, if there's only 4 frisbees on the field and there's one goal to score the frisbees, then you have to put that into your own thoughts, like into your design perspective, knowing that you can only do this task 4 times. So the maximum value you can get is the value of 4 frisbees, and that applies to your cost-benefit analysis. A good point from Sarah in chat is COTS stands for consumer off the shelf, so things that you can just buy yourself. Studica carries a whole bunch of COTS parts for FTC, Rev Robotics, Go Builda, Tetrix, AndyMark. You want to take a look at their websites to see what's out there that can help you build your robot, especially in times of COVID where teams may not be able to meet in person as often. You might want to see if you can buy some, instead of having to fully manufacture something, maybe you want to buy something. Drivetrain especially, it's like, hey, like, a lot of these companies have prepackaged drivetrains. You might want to look at that, since you might not be able to access your normal shop resources and sorts of tools. Should strategy considerations be added into your team's engineering notebook? Absolutely. I'm not too familiar with what the engineering notebook's going to look like this year. So tune into Mickey's presentation later on today where you can learn all about that. But in general, the judges want to know what your design process is like. And your design process is not just the physical build of the robot. The way you chose your physical build of the robot, your strategic design, is super, super important. So you should be making entries in your notebook as soon as you get the game manual and as soon as you start brainstorming. Getting those notes into the engineering notebook, number one, preserves them somewhere safe where your team has them. And number two, it's great for the judges to see the full design process. I know one of the things that I love learning about robots is I like to see how they've evolved over time and like what the initial concept was, what the first version was, what the new concept was based on the first version, and that full every single cycle. And at all those cycles, the strategy considerations apply. But then when you're done your robot and you're starting to think about your match strategies, you want to get them in there too. We want to see this whole sort of process. The other piece is, and if you skip to the next slide, we'll see one of the things that you make is a priority list where you're listing in order the subsystems that you want to work on. Having that priority list nicely documented is really, really important because say it's the night before the event and you need to figure out, okay, we only have time to add one more thing. Well, the way you choose what to add, it's not about, oh, well, this one is the coolest looking, or this is the one that, Jenny worked on and Jenny really wants to get this on the robot. You want to look at your priority list. And the higher it is on your priority list, that's the one that has to go on because your strategic design determined that that's more important. So we're running down here on time, and I just want to thank everyone in chat who's like put the questions in there, especially our planning committee members who added a whole bunch of great questions for me. So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Jamie, for all that good stuff. This has been, a fun presentation. If you want to see the full Effective First Strategy presentation, take a look online. You can find it on YouTube, search Effective First Strategies and my name, it'll be there. Slides are available online as well. It's all very, very good stuff.